and welcome to another episode of Tesseract Talks, the place where we put the spotlight on tech trends, startups, and VCs. I'm your host, Marko, the founder and CEO of Tesseract Analytics, and it is my pleasure today to have Oliver Rochford as our guest. Besides being one of the board members here at Tesseract Analytics, he's the former Gartner Research Director for Cybersecurity and has worked in a number of companies such as Tenable, Darktrace, Securonix, and now a co-founder at AuNoo AI. Oliver, welcome back. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you very much, Marko, and thank you for having me on again.
So the topic today will be your current company, AuNoo AI, and how we can uncover insights with AI-powered news and trends analysis. So let's start by you telling us first what inspired you to co-found AuNoo AI and how the name and the metaphor, Auspex and Noosphere reflect the company's mission.
So, about 2.5 years ago, when this whole crazy AI mania kicked off, I started asking around people, former analysts, investors, tech leaders, okay, what's going on? Is this real or not? I could not get a straight answer. One person would tell me it's complete hype. Another person would say, we're going to be out of a job in 18 months. I started basically thinking, okay, I need to do a little bit of more analysis around this. So I started building a tool to look at essentially news at scale. Because what I wanted to see is what's the consensus on this and what's the data coming in. And, fast forward a little bit and I built an entire, what's called a foresight tool, which puts in a lot of open source data, essentially news, research papers, that kind of stuff. And to try to make sense of a specific topic, originally AI. What's interesting is that it was very quickly noticeable that approach would extend to almost any trending topic or any kind of topic where you're trying to, I would say, because we're not really predicting the future. We are looking at what people believe is going to happen. And we are starting to track that and we're trying to extrapolate from that. And, coming back to the name itself, so in Auspex, it's a Roman term. It was a seer, basically someone who would try to predict the future based off of omens, things like, the flight of birds, And the noosphere is a philosophical concept. And it's essentially, if you imagine you have something like the geosphere, or you have something like the atmosphere, well, the noosphere is the sphere of human intelligence and thought. It's basically the collective intelligence. And so we consider ourselves as really mining that noosphere to be able to extrapolate what people believe is going to happen in the future. Coming back to the AI thing, I have a newsletter which I've been using to really to put this information out to people, because of course that's the important thing. It's pointless if you just kind of keep it to yourself. And that's really was the genesis of this. Starting to share with people this journey of, is AI real or isn't it? And if you want to know, is AI real? Is it hype or not? Right now, our data, it used to say AI is going to accelerate. And I'll be honest, for about a year, it's been pointing towards a gradual evolution. So that's kind of the finding. So it's quite interesting that that's actually changed from a sentiment perspective.
And how does AuNoo AI balance the AI-powered analysis with human insight to transform the scattered open source intelligence into the actionable intelligence?
So if you kind of follow the whole progress of LLMs, Gen AI, at this point, there are various authorities, Apple, BBC News, Google, who all say you should not use AI to just autonomously summarize stuff. The truth is that there are issues with the way that LLMs approach this. If you're trying to get a high-level insight into what an article is about, it's great. If you want to have a concise, comprehensive summary of every single pertinent data point, it's not. Also, some data is ambiguous. And what I mean by that is sentiment depends. It depends on really what you're looking for. And so sometimes the source material might not be that clear, so that the AI might not have a clear identification. It might need a human to help it. We also notice that LLMs in particular, they give you an approximation of things like cargo cult futurism. If you say to it, give me a prediction, it will give you something that looks a lot like a plausible prediction. It will even add a percentage, but there's no framework behind this. There's no theory. So we've gone about it a different way. We've actually we've also noticed that foresight tools are generally really complicated. For most casual users or business users, they're not usable. You need an intermediate, basically a futurist. But LLMs are very good at using foresight tools. So we've actually developed a set of foresight tools, particularly to enable LLMs to be good at doing predictive forecasting. And we keep a human in the loop because what matters is that the data that goes in is good. So humans are involved, usually one of our analysts or somebody on our client side to help curate the data. And once you have a good, solid data set, an AI can make good sense out of it and do magical things with it, to be honest, but bad data in, bad data out.
Who is AuNoo AI aimed for? Who is the target audience that can extract the most value out of these solutions?
So foresight tools are generally used by anyone who has to make strategic planning assumptions or decisions in the future. So in most companies, there will be what's called an individual contributor, could be somebody like an M&A strategist, could be somebody in product management, could be somebody in procurement who's going to be using a tool like this, and they will be using it to inform their executive team. You have journalists and government organizations. And if you want a more practical example around this, different companies have a different future planning horizon. If you think of a whiskey company, an aged whiskey is 12 years old, they need to try to predict demand 12 years ahead because you're producing now for in 12 years' time. If you think of a media company, they might have a 5 to 10-year planning horizon. It's a bit more imminent. They might be focused on legislation around copyright, for example. And so I think that's important to note. There are different risk appetites and different horizons for planning. But in terms of actually using this, I think almost everyone within a company does a little bit of this, whether they know it or not. It's often not formalized.
The idea of the Noosphere, which you already touched upon, the sphere of human thought, is fascinating. How does AuNoo AI interpret that collective consciousness in a practical, real-world context?
I mean, so our planning assumption was that we're going to tap into almost any kind of data that's available, where people express an opinion, a sentiment, share information. And so just from the get-go, we looked at social media, we looked at academic journals and research, and we looked at news. Of course, we can get proprietary data in as well. So if you, for example, I don't know, you might have a CRM feed, for example, you might have even a customer knowledge base, you might want to integrate that. But generally, anything which I would say is structured as a report or a message, you have an author, you have a content, you have, maybe a publication date, is something that we can use. And of course, it represents really what people are expressing. And if you think of this in terms of the human thought, I think LLMs are a good way to think of having captured that, right? But you add news to it, current news, and you also get a much stronger signal for what's basically to anchor that whole realm of possibility into something now. If you think of prompting or prompt engineering, you're basically saying, act as an advisor for X. We're prompting it with the news, which will allow it to put it into that right space to be able to make predictions because it is a predictive model. Now, it's not very good at, it's normally used to predict words, but in this case, we can actually use it to look at all of these articles in aggregate and look at what people are saying and synthesize that. So it's not usually the LLM doing the predicting, I have to say that as well. So we look at this as actually mining the noosphere because we are looking at this in aggregate. But I make it sound really easy. You can't just feed a bunch of news articles into an LLM. We have this whole framework of how we structure the news because the limitation is that you can't feed a lot of news articles into AI. So you have to find a good way of summarizing it so that the AI can look at it at volume, at scale, but it has enough information to not have to hallucinate. And I think that's where the technology combines with the data to create something really, really new. But it provides the AI with guidance so that it's not just making stuff up.
And with information flowing so fast, how does AuNoo AI stay ahead of trends, particularly subtle or early stage shifts that are often easy to miss?
So the funny thing is that we're not even using AI for that. We're using a more traditional approach called vector embedding. So if you imagine the way that most recommendation engines work, Netflix, Google, they all essentially turn all of the content into what's called a text embedding. And it converts it into semantic meaning. And what I mean by that, a typical example that you will hear is that if you imagine royalty, you have basically royalty as a concept. Now, if you add a gender, male, female, royalty becomes king and queen. If you add an age to it, young, it would be prince and princess. And once you start putting articles or names, let's say you put people into there, different royalties, they will automatically be grouped according to where they fit closest to those parameters. I'm simplifying it because it doesn't do this across 3 or 4 dimensions. It does this across potentially 1,000. But what's interesting about that is that it behaves almost like a lava lamp. You have a bunch of articles coming in. If they're similar in meaning, similar in context, they will actually group together. And of course, what you see then is that you will see basically a small group forming and growing very quickly. And what that indicates essentially is that something is obviously, I would say something is evolving very quickly there. But I say I'm not being too specific here because it could either be a viral topic, it could also be a botnet, it could be disinformation, it could also be syndicated news. So there's of course lots of local news which is syndicated. It's just aggregated across, I don't know, Alabama news, Florida news, but it's essentially the same article. And so you can see these kind of things just by being able to group the articles and comparing them by how alike they are and how not alike they are. And so we then use AI to describe that. So you identify it using the first method, and then AI looks at this behavior and then makes sense of these patterns. Of course, so what kind of stuff can we actually find using this? So I love that you can basically slice and dice this and compare this across multiple dimensions. So for example, we noticed the trough of disillusionment, the sentiment of AI dropping in about October. And what we saw is that before that, we had this positive sentiment line up here, and we had a neutral and negative sentiment lines down here. And all of a sudden, they converged. It's not as though everyone went negative on AI. It's just that all of a sudden, the positive voices started, becoming a little bit less positive, or there were a lot more neutral voices for sure. And I think that just reflects the fact, what we're seeing in articles, 95% failure rate. Harvard Business Review said this week about Gen AI project. Our system has been predicting a bubble for about 3-4 months. And I mentioned my newsletter earlier because the reason why we put this out is that if you make predictions, you have to show people in advance. You can't say afterwards, we predicted this. Once it's out there, it's out there. And if you go through the newsletter, we were talking about a bubble about 4 or 5 months ago. And Sam Altman this week said, probably a bubble. But my favorite finding was that based on the data, OpenAI GPT 4.1 determined there are actual 2 AI timelines. There's a AI timeline for tech executives where AGI is going to be here in 18 months and everyone's going to be automated away. And then there's everybody else's timeline where actually it's probably maybe 15 to 20 years away. And that is based off of the data. And the funniest thing is that if you do sentiment analysis, business data, by definition, it's upbeat. Business publications don't really publish negative data. So once you start putting non-business media into it, you take marketing out of it and that kind of stuff, actually it becomes a little bit more measured. Not negative, because the other finding is that this is not hype. The technology is not rubbish. It does solve a lot of problems. It's just that 18 to 24 months is not enough for something like this to be fully matured. And I think that's the takeaway. This is going to be a little bit slower. It's going to be a slow evolution, but the findings are definitely interesting and funny. But some of the things that we can do, and this is an exercise we ran a couple of weeks ago, is that because we're looking at media bias and political bias, we can actually run basically the future according to the right, the future according to the left. So we can do very granular breakdowns across this, which once you combine this with foresight tools, because there's a lot of tools who will give you news articles and sentiment analysis, but it's not combined with a very good set of frameworks and methodologies to actually do good, solid foresight and forecasting, because you can't predict the future, but you can extrapolate scenarios and start measuring against these scenarios. And I think that's a different thing.
What are the primary ethical or technical challenges in aggregating and analyzing open source data at this scale? And how does AuNoo AI address them?
And so it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we did a lot of market research before we built this tool around news and media consumption. And at this point, I think it's somewhere like half of people have basically switched off of news. There's news fatigue. AI fatigue is another thing, right? Like, I'm fatigued of AI, but I have to follow it as my job. But people just get really, really worn down around this. And the reason is quite simple. Most news in this day and age, it's designed to polarize. It's clickbait. Let's be honest with you. And it's a pity, because you need to be informed. Not just as a citizen. I want my employees to be informed. How can they make business decisions if they don't want to read the news? Because essentially, the well of wisdom is being poisoned. Even though it's understandable, because I don't want to value judge, it's not my job. But from an ethical perspective, it's not our job to tell you what to read. It's not our job to say this is bad or this is good. It's to give you tools for you to make that decision. And so we put the media bias data into there, but we're not going to hide data from you. If you don't want to see something, that's down to you. I quite like seeing even opposing voices because I'm an analyst. I don't try to judge other people's opinions. I try to understand them. And I think for that, you need to do it. But I don't want to make that decision for someone or value judge it. However, coming back to this, if you want to read news in a sanitized way, without all of the bias, all of the emotion into it, use a tool like this, because we just boil it down to its most minimum. This is what you need to know. This is what's happening. This is what X says, what Y says, and we're not trying to give you a position on it. And the second thing is that there are lots of places in the world where analyzing news is actually really important. I think climate change is a good example. If you go digging, every mainstream publication publishes climate change news. Everyone, MSNBC, NBC, all of them. BBC, you barely see it on the front page. You sure as hell won't see it on your feed. You put it through a tool like ours, we do not hide it based on an algorithm. We surface it as a neutral trend. And so that way you get to see stuff in a non-emotional way that you need to know, right? That's the thing. This is not, you can try to stick your head in the sand, but actually ultimately that just means that someone else is going to make these decisions for you.
Okay. And so what's next for AuNoo AI? Any exciting features or expansions on the horizon that listeners should know about?
Yeah, so obviously we have a community edition coming out in October. And when I mean community edition, is going to be like basically code available, but it's a fair use license. You can use it. You can even build a consulting service around it. What you can't do is sell the software, run it as a SaaS service, manage it for somebody. That's what we do as a business. But if you're an end user, you might be a marketing person, a strategist, download it, self-host it, even with self-hosted LLM models. So that's what's coming out. Support for local LLM model. So that I think that's a really exciting thing, because if you might not want that data to go through a cloud provider. So that's one example, depending on the kind of research that you're doing. If you're doing investigative journalism, for example, that might be something where you just want to keep it to yourself, or it might be a data privacy issue. The other thing which we have coming out is just far more connectors. We started out with Blue Sky, we started out with ArcSIF, we started out with a couple of news aggregators, but we've got an RSS integrated, collector coming out. We also have a Firecrawl collector coming out, which allows you to just do far more AI-based scraping and so on. But it has to be said, we generally try to integrate with third-party news feeds. So if you have one which you need, definitely let us know. And the other thing which we have the main UX between the user and the actual, essentially is a knowledge graph of your entire news topic, is Auspex, our AI. And so Auspex has got a lot of enhancements. There's a bunch of tools which we've already added around it being able to create a database to an external news. But we also have a deep research feature coming out where you can just dig down deeper into a topic, similar to kind of like you would know for Notebook LM. And why do you need us if you have Notebook LM? Because the way that we treat your news and your topic is unique to you. Now, I think that might be one thing worth mentioning. Most news aggregators will be keyword based. We don't. You start with a question. You want to know whether cloud repatriation is happening. That's what our tool does. You want to know if AI is hype. That is how we frame that whole construct. It is based on answering the question, not keywords. Yeah.
Well, sounds great and exciting. Thank you so much, Oliver, for coming to the show. It was a pleasure as always. That was all for today. And to our audience, make sure to check out AuNoo AI until next episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye.